Hi, I'm Kevin Werbach, professor of legal studies and business ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. For decades, I've studied emerging technologies, from broadband to blockchain. Today, AI is promising to transform our world. But AI needs accountability, mechanisms to ensure it's developed and deployed in responsible, safe, and trustworthy ways. On this podcast, I speak with the experts leading the charge for accountable AI. Anthropic's dispute with the Pentagon and recent military conflicts around the world have brought attention to autonomous weapon systems. What does accountable AI mean when AI is part of systems whose primary function is to kill? Fortunately, one of my colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania is among the world's top experts on this topic. Michael Horowitz is a political science professor at Penn, director of Perry Worldhouse, and a former senior official at the U.S. Department of Defense, where he was the principal author of the U.S. Political Declaration on Responsible Military Use of AI and Autonomy. Mike, pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
First, can you talk about just how aggressively the U.S. military and other militaries are leaning into AI today?
It's a good question, and I think the way I would think about artificial intelligence from a military perspective is to put uses of AI into three buckets. The first are uses of AI that essentially are the same as the way a private sector company or a university or something like might use artificial intelligence. So think about this in terms of HR, payroll processing, basic logistics, like business functions, essentially that like even for the Pentagon don't differ like that much from what, and what some other business might do. So that's bucket one. Bucket two is what I would call intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And that is all of the vast information that the US military gets from all the satellites that are up in space, all the airborne sensors, maybe information from human intelligence sources, information from battlefields, all of that data. And the volume of that data is overwhelming. And so for many years, I mean, this isn't a like today thing, it's more like a decade ago story. The militaries have been interested in using older AI tools like computer vision to try to process all of that data, extract the signal from the noise, get accurate information faster. And so that's just like the dial has just been turned way up on that now in the current period. So that's bucket two. Bucket three is closer to the pointy end of the spear. And that in there are two like little subcategories sort of there. The first is what are called AI decision support systems, sort of like a Maven Smart System, which is a tool a dashboard essentially that was developed by a company called Palantir. And that's been in the news a bit, lately because Palantir is essentially, the Palantir dashboard is available for every senior US military leader around the world. And that's helping them essentially process information and do their operational workflow faster. We can get into that if you want. And then there's the far like pointy end of the spear in a category of what are called autonomous weapon systems. And those are the use of artificial intelligence or frankly, simpler autonomy to select and engage targets without human oversight, after being activated by a person. But where essentially you would have an algorithm say you have an algorithm trained on a data set of Russian tanks or something and in targeting them. So we have those three buckets. And so military see lots of advantages to this. They're all the same kind of efficiency process advantages that you might see in the corporate world. But then in a world where making better decisions and making faster decisions better can be the difference between winning and losing on the battlefield, there are lots of advantages to militaries in effectively incorporating AI.
So let's put the first bucket to the side. It's important to mention that obviously the Pentagon is a huge, maybe the biggest enterprise, and all of those use cases are significant
so
for
big.
AI.
It's one of the largest office, like
Yeah.
the Pentagon itself is one of America's largest office buildings, essentially. Like
Mhm.
people know that the military is big, but it is a huge bureaucracy. A lot of efficiency you can get.
Mhm.
Sorry.
So all that's critically important, and all the issues that we talk about with AI governance and the private sector are going to be relevant there too. The second two, though, seem to be potentially distinctive. And what I want to ask about is, with this shift from predictive machine learning to generative AI, we're now dealing with systems which, first of all, are really at the cutting edge. We don't really understand how they work. They're non-deterministic. They have this inherent error capability or possibility. How much concern is there in the military about deploying those kinds of technologies in these use cases?
I think, I mean, and I'm most familiar with the American military since I
Mhm.
spent a
Sure.
couple of years working I've done a couple of different stints in the Pentagon, but most recently from 2022 to 2024. And I think there is a both simultaneous recognition that it kind of has to happen. Like this
Mhm.
is inevitable. Like either you're for it or you're going to get run over, but also some concern about it. And by that, what I mean is militaries are really little c conservative institutions. And they're really in their little c conservative institutions because the decisions that they make, lives are on the line, like literally. I mean, it's the job of the military to, essentially to kill people. Like the business of the Pentagon is the business of war. And because of that, there's no institution in some ways more incentivized to ensure their technology works appropriately than the military. Because when they get it wrong, people die and they can die. And so that leads to some natural conservatism when it comes to integration of emerging technologies. Now it's like that's like a little bit different if you're like being invaded the way that Ukraine is or something like that. But in general, and so there is that sort of natural conservatism, like, and especially within the context of these large language model tools, if they're black boxes, if they're not simply like predictive, either for vision or text, how do we know if they're working? How do we know if we can trust them? How do we know if they're reliable? And so that leads to then some questions about, all right, like what are the kinds of situations where you can trust them? And what you try to do then is prove that they are reliable at a certain level. So that even if you're not 100% sure how it's operating, you understand how reliable it is. But there's then an interest in seeking to take these tools because they're so powerful and throw them at especially large data sets and complicated problems, and especially operational workflows that are still almost entirely analog, to try to speed those things along. But it's balanced by that kind of conservatism.
Hmm. All right, so let's talk about the pointy end of the spear, as you say, the autonomous weapons, where you know as much about this as anyone, I think.
For better or
And
worse.
there's been a lot of discussion with Anthropic's dispute with the Pentagon, where one of their red lines was use of Claude for autonomous weapons. Um, how first of all, how worried should we be that the killer robots are here or they're coming? How widespread is this practice? How much is it a hypothetical today versus a reality, say for the U.S.?
Don't worry about the killer robots. I promise. Whatever you can worry. Here's the thing. So uh there are two different kinds of weapon systems I want to differentiate between. Semi-autonomous weapon systems are weapon systems where a human aims them at a target, and then the weapon system can essentially go hit the target basically on its own. These are all the precision weapons that the US militaries around the world have sort of used for decades, and that we think are both more effective and reduce collateral damage and civilian harm because they're just way more accurate than, say, like World War II area bombing or something like that. So you have semi-autonomous weapons. And within that category, you have some of them, like, say, the Tomahawk missile that's been in the news because of the US using it against Iran, where there's essentially a human almost like riding shotgun on it up to the point of impact because it's GPS guided. Maybe you have real-time satellite. You've got like some access to information about how it's going. There's also this whole category, though, of semi-autonomous weapons with no human supervision, like a radar-guided missile, for example. A pilot sees a ping, and they're flying an aircraft. They see a ping that says there's an enemy radar nearby. They launch a radar-guided missile, and it goes for a certain distance. It turns on a seeker. It detects the radar, and it hits the radar. That radar might be on top of a school. That radar might be on top of a hospital. Like the missile doesn't know, and like that kind of weapon has essentially been around since the 70s or early 80s, and dozens of countries like have that kind of weapon. And that's only a semi-autonomous weapon system. And then we have autonomous weapon systems. And again, they can be human supervised or non-human supervised. And here's the rub. For more than 40 years, the United States military has deployed a system called the close-in weapon system. It's an enormous Gatling gun that basically sits on US Navy ships to protect it from a large numbers of attacks coming in. It has an automatic mode that where if there are too many threats coming in for an operator even to point and click on, the operator can turn on the automatic mode, and by algorithm, it can select and engage targets. With the human could turn it off if they want, but the human has nothing to do. And it's been publicly acknowledged that that system has been used in the Red Sea in the last 5 years to protect U.S. ships from Houthi attacks. And again, this is an algorithm selecting and engaging targets on its own, and that's tech the U.S. military, and by the way, 40 militaries around the world have been using since the 80s. And so what's new in the context of the Anthropic conversation in some ways is this potential category of autonomous weapon systems with no human supervision. There's some antecedents to that we can talk about as well. But then especially this question of what kinds of algorithms are most appropriate. And are large language models ready for the task of guiding an autonomous weapon system? I'll be honest, I don't really think they're there yet. Like if you were going to design an autonomous weapon system, the last thing that you would use is like Claude trained on the slop of the internet. Like before you did that, what you really want is say a bespoke algorithm trained on a very particular data set. Like these are Chinese fighters, these are Russian tanks, using like computer vision essentially to detect, something gets in an area, like turns on its sensor and it's like, oh, that is a thing I've been trained to hit. I can go hit that. And that is not a thing I've been trained to hit. I won't go hit that. That's pretty determinate. That's way different than like Grok or Claude or like ChatGPT or something. But those things can exist and like frankly have existed for like quite a while. We just haven't really talked about them.
Well, ironically, that's one of the big arguments that Anthropic is making, why they don't want Claude to be used in these use cases, that they don't believe it's accurate enough.
I mean, I don't think they're wrong about that. Now, I mean, I think that I do think it's interesting and happy to talk about the dispute a little bit in that, and Anthropic CEO on the Thursday evening before they got labeled a supply chain risk, released what's probably the longest statement they have ever had on autonomous weapon systems in particular. And by the way, public service announcement. The correct term of art from a U.S. government perspective is autonomous weapon system. When Anthropic talks about fully autonomous weapons, I think it generates confusion sometimes because it's not exactly clear when they say that, like what kinds of systems they're talking about. And whatever, there's like endemic terminological issues in this area, just like in any area. But like this is one where it actually caused some misunderstanding between Anthropic and the Pentagon. But what Anthropic actually said is they don't have a philosophical objection to autonomous weapon systems. They don't even have a philosophical objection to large language models being used for autonomous weapon systems. And they're willing to work with the Pentagon on making them work. They just don't think they're ready now. And like that is the tragedy of this dispute in some ways to me. Like there's no use case that Anthropic is currently doing for the Pentagon where either side is upset about. There is no ask the Pentagon has made of Anthropic that Anthropic won't do. Yet they've now been labeled like a Chinese company as a threat to national security. Like, how did we get here?
Yeah. No, there's a lot to be said about that. And I don't think most people realize that Anthropic is the only or the first of the large language model companies that's even available on these classified systems. It wasn't that they were resisting these military uses.
Yeah, I mean, the AI companies had been doing some unclassified work, like poking around the edges for a while, but this isn't, I think lots of people know the story, a story of how Silicon Valley was funded by defense dollars, like way back in the day, like during the Cold War. But the AI companies that are now the, like titans of industry in some ways, in this like generation of American business, they didn't start as companies that thought they were going to be doing business with the military. But as advances in artificial intelligence have increasingly made clear that it's a general purpose technology that's going to be everywhere, like everywhere in the economy, everywhere in society, that includes militaries, then you have all of these companies that never thought of themselves as likely to do business with the American military or in China, the Chinese military, like whatever, who all of a sudden are building tech that the government's like, this is really important. Like we need this for national security. And Anthropic was the first one in the door willing to not just do unclassified work, but to do classified work, which is why it's so like tragic in some ways from a U.S. national
Mhm.
security perspective that this feud is happening.
So let's get back to autonomous weapon systems specifically. What kinds of frameworks or agreements are there today for militaries to use these technologies?
It's a good question. So there's the place that I would start is, and that I think it's left out of the public conversation a lot, is that due to international humanitarian law and requirements to have the use of force have distinction, where you're distinguishing between, say, a military or civilian, and proportionality, or using force in proportion to like how much you need to, like, et cetera. There is an implied requirement there that the U.S. military firmly believes it exists for human responsibility over the use of force. And the requirement for human responsibility over the use of force exists whether you are firing, whether it's a bow and arrow, whether it's a machine gun, whether it's a radar guided missile, whether it's an autonomous weapon system. If you start from there, I think the pieces actually start to fall into place a little bit, because the thing that people sometimes worry about in the context of autonomous weapon systems is that there's going to be an accountability gap. There's no person responsible or accountable. In some ways, if you ended up in that situation, you would already be talking about a use of force that would be illegal from the perspective of the American military. And so the Pentagon then has a policy that my old office in the Pentagon wrote while I was there, called Department of Defense Directive 3000.09, Autonomy in Weapon Systems. And that governs essentially the development. So like doing the research and development and moving toward procuring the system, and then fielding, like, all right, we bought it. Like, how do we get it to the Army unit, the Navy unit, et cetera? The development and fielding of semi-autonomous systems, weapon systems, all the precision weapons, and then autonomous weapon systems. And what it does is lay out both the requirements for those systems, like all of the testing and evaluation that you have to do to prove they work. Because remember what I said before, systems that don't work aren't useful to the military, and commanders and operators won't trust them. And it also sets up that for some types of autonomous weapon systems, those that don't have human supervision, essentially, there's an extra layer of review beyond the really stringent reviews that every weapon system goes under, where it's not just that the system has to go through all the tests to prove that it works. It then also has to be essentially like run by senior leaders, like the number 2 in the entire American military, and a couple of very senior civilian, Senate confirmed civilian officials, to just do that double check to make sure that, hey, this is actually a good idea, like, and it works. And so, I mean, like the Pentagon, I was joking before with the Pentagon as a bureaucracy. There's always process. There's so much process. And so and that process in this case, in some ways, should be reassuring, because it makes it actually a lot more unlikely than people would think that the
Mhm.
Pentagon would field some kind of like wacky killer robot that like didn't work or would put people in harm's way that shouldn't be, et cetera.
What exactly does that phrase human responsibility for use of force mean? Is that analogous to when people talk about human in the loop in AI governance? How should we understand it?
That is a good question. I would say human responsibility, I would think about more in terms of the law of armed conflict. Like if you have a, like, for example, in the outset of the Iran operation, it appears that, based on publicly available sources now, it appears as though a U.S. Tomahawk missile may have tragically hit a school in Iran, leading to a lot of civilian casualties. And the American military right now is doing a really detailed after action investigation to try to figure out exactly what happened. And it is, in putting aside the politics of the current moment, it is what normal practice would be for the military, is to figure out who the military actually will have a rubric to figure out who are the people that should have known. How did this mistake happen? Who are the people that should have known, or who are the people that should have caught the error, however the error happened? And then, like, and then depending on what the error was and what part of the process, et cetera, those people will probably be reprimanded or punished in one way or another. Look, like sometimes accidents genuinely do happen, but the military has really detailed systems for that. So by responsibility and accountability, what we mean is there is a person that said, go use this piece of technology. So they're taking responsibility for it. And there's accountability. in that if there's an accident, that like they're the ones on the line, like they're the ones that authorize the use of force. And so that's why they need to be, according to Pentagon policy, they need to have, what's called appropriate human judgment over the use of force, meaning they're trained and understand both the upsides and limits of any autonomous weapon system so they can make an informed decision about using it.
But does that only happen at the front end when a system's being developed or fielded? What happens when it's out there, in a battlefield situation?
So that responsibility exists anytime there's the actual use of force.
Mhm.
And so that has to exist regardless. The decision making surrounding the use of force, though, is in some ways technology agnostic.
Hmm.
The same responsibility and accountability provisions that mean that if you were firing, if you had like mounted knights that were going to later like throw spears at somebody or something, those same kind of provisions would apply in the context of an autonomous weapon system being sort of used on the battlefield as well. It essentially requires militaries to come up with like new standard operating procedures to like figure out how this works in a world of autonomous weapon systems. But again, there have been really simple versions of these that have been around for decades. And so militaries actually have a lot more experience using
Mhm.
simple versions of artificial intelligence than people, I think, tend to realize.
Hmm. And so we have these doctrines and these policies in the U.S. military. What happens if, say China, Russia, North Korea, take your pick, the adversary, they don't want to play by those rules?
Good question. I think one of the really interesting things in this context, and we talk about the U.S. and China a lot in the AI context, obviously, because the U.S. and China are competing for global leadership in AI across lots of things, like not just in the military arena. And one of the really interesting things is if you get U.S. and Chinese, either like folks that do a military AI sort of together, they actually don't sound all that different. Like since I've left the government, I've been in some track two discussions with Chinese interlocutors, and the kinds of things they say about responsible AI and about ensuring that systems are trustworthy are not frankly that like they use like the words in like slightly different orders or whatever, but they're not expressing views that are fundamentally different. The thing that say the United States worries about when it comes to a country like China's use of AI from a military perspective, though, is different and relates to China's political regime. In that because China is an autocracy, obviously, like led by Xi, the Chinese government in some ways doesn't trust their people in the first place. If they trusted their people, they might have a different kind of political regime. And so the incentive structure, and you see this in China actually all the time now, the incentive structure is like Xi tries to consolidate power, is to cut people out of the decision-making process. And so the thing you worry about in an autocratic context is that you end up with essentially unsafe centralization of decision-making, where like too many people are cut out essentially to be able to make good decisions. Or at least that's the concern sometimes. But on paper, like the way the US talks about using AI from a military perspective, the way China talks about using AI from a military perspective, actually not as different as you might imagine.
Hmm. So the two recent conflicts where there's been a lot of apparent use of AI and various autonomous technologies for targeting, being Israel's conflict in Gaza and Russia Ukraine, where lots of use of drones and these semi-autonomous systems and so forth. What's the sense of what we're learning from what's happened in those two conflicts?
I mean, I think we are seeing obviously intense public interest in these systems, and also how nascent some of them are. For example, like there's been a lot of controversy about Israel's Lavender system in the context of the Gaza war, and some of these accusations that the Lavender system is like queuing up targets for people that have then like a couple of seconds to either like approve it or not approve it, and like then maybe there's a strike that is against a civilian. That's not really how Lavender works. I think and there's like good public reporting that suggests that. I think it's much further back in the decision-making process. It's like one input that goes into a decision that's going through several human checks before somebody's using lethal force. To be clear, that doesn't mean that it's risk-free. And there's certainly the risk of automation bias in that context. where say if there's a recommendation from Lavender and that recommendation is like, I don't know, suppose it's 75% accurate, but people treat it as if it's 99% accurate, you're then going to introduce some more errors into the system. But like, I think part of this, I think part of the Israel conversation is actually a like rules of engagement conversation. And that if what Israel is doing, and like, I don't actually know the answer to this, like per se, but it seems sometimes like what Israel is doing is essentially taking, or what Israel was doing in the Gaza context was essentially taking output maybe from algorithms that wasn't, that you actually didn't have super high confidence in, and then like going ahead with
Mm.
operations on that basis. That's not the algorithm's fault. Like if the algorithm's like,
No.
say the algorithm's like 55% accurate and you know
Mhm.
it's 50% accurate and you're like, that's good enough, let's do it. Like that's not an
Mhm.
algorithm issue. That's a rules of engagement issue in some ways. And although like whatever, but that, a lot of that's uncertain. In the US context now, we are seeing the real like debut of a platform called a Maven Smart System from the company Palantir. And one of the plugins, one of the many plugins to Maven Smart System is Claude, the Anthropic technology. And what's that? The way that it essentially works is imagine it as a paralegal helping a lawyer. So all sorts of like background research and assessment and analysis that like simplifies a ton of the workflow to queue things up for senior leaders to make decisions. But like no matter how good your paralegal is, it's still the lawyer going to court. It's still the lawyer making the decision. And I think that's what the way that this kind of system works for the United States right now is it's essentially doing dramatic work to speed up and to make more efficient the workflow involved in macro target selection. But that output then goes through a bunch of layers of scrutiny, including a final decision by a commander prior to prior to force being used. So it's simultaneously actually like a really big deal from a military planning process,
Mhm.
and there's still heavy human involvement.
Mhm. And what about Ukraine with the drone warfare that's happening there?
I think in the Ukraine context, we're seeing something a little bit different. In the Ukraine context, there's been increasing use of AI on the battlefield, and like necessity has been the mother of invention for the Ukrainians since the drop, like since Russia's invasion in 2022, and they have, I think, pioneered a lot of uses of essentially AI decision support tools, kind of like Maven ish, to try to help them queue up um, like more automated responses to attacks from the Russians and for target prioritization. And also between Ukraine and Russia now, 60 to 70% of the casualties between Ukraine and Russia on the front lines are driven by one-way attack drones. Now, those are generally remotely piloted. They're not autonomous. They're not necessarily AI driven. But one of the things that Ukraine has started to do is build in essentially last mile autonomy. Because if somebody fires a weapon at you and there's a data link between, say, an operator with if we're talking about one of these like first person view drones, there's a data link between the operator and then the drone that's going to hit a Russian tank. What Russia tries to do then is jam the data link, disrupt the data link. So then the human operator loses control of that drone and like it falls out of the sky or like whatever it's going to do. And one of the things that Ukraine's been doing is programming these drones. They've been doing lots. They've been using fiber optic cables and like all sorts of things to like make this stuff work. But if you lose connectivity, generating last mile autonomy, so that if it's close enough, it can then turn on a sensor, and be like, oh, that's a Russian tank,
Mhm.
and it can hit it. And so we're really seeing some of this stuff start to play out in the Russia-Ukraine context in a way that I think a lot of people have written about, but we see it, and just the drone war in general, at an industrial scale
Mhm.
that is unprecedented.
Mhm. All right. So one last thing, just to get back to the LLMs and the Anthropic situation and so forth. As you mentioned, a lot of Silicon Valley came out of defense spending and things like DARPA being what basically brought us the original technology of the internet. And now we have these private sector companies like the big AI companies who are absolutely at the frontier in terms of technology, including for military purposes. So how does that change things? What do you see, beyond this particular controversy with Anthropic and the Pentagon? How is that relationship likely to develop, and what does it mean for our military going forward?
I think there are some real challenges that have been introduced by this controversy that, and it's not clear exactly how they'll pan out. Since if the government didn't like the conditions that Anthropic wanted to put in its contract, they could certainly decide not to renew. They could decide to cancel the contract. Like that's a thing that happens in the business world all the time in between like governments and businesses. But the Pentagon has essentially decided to salt the earth through labeling Anthropic as a supply chain risk. And the challenge then is it could signal to other companies that, there's some companies that are already working with the Pentagon or thinking about working with the Pentagon, but for someone that hasn't made that choice, if there's now a non-zero risk that if you have a contract dispute with the Pentagon over terms of service, essentially, that might lead to them not just canceling the contract, but attempting to destroy your business outside of that. You could certainly imagine a world in which that has a bit of a chilling effect, because there's been a lot of improvement in the relationship between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon over many years, as these companies have realized, and I think especially realized when they saw Ukraine using essentially some of their tools to protect itself against Russia's invasion. They saw the use case for their technology in a fight for good. And I think that helped shape sort of greater receptivity. And it's not that companies aren't going to step in the breach now. XAI has now said it'll do classified work with the Pentagon. OpenAI is now working on a deal with the Pentagon as well. And OpenAI actually, I think, genuinely wishes for whatever deal they sign to also apply to Anthropic. Like they, obviously those companies compete, but it's not. And the way that this has happened with Anthropic is not good for OpenAI for all the reasons that I just said, essentially. And so I think they would actually like a deal that could also work for Anthropic potentially. So companies will get in the door in the short term, but this is not going to be quite as simple as just like, this is not just like, oh, you were using this chatbot one day and now I'm going to use this other chatbot another day. Cloud is now embedded in classified workflows that the military uses around the world, and disentangling that and then plugging in and testing another system and validating it, like that's going to take time. And I mean, I hope at least that Anthropic and the government can come to some kind of agreement, since this controversy seems like totally needless from my perspective. But no, I mean, this does really shake up relations between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon once again.
Yeah, we'll see. No, I agree with you, and I think it's a really significant turning point in a lot of ways about how we go forward with AI in this country. Mike, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to come back anytime.
This has been The Road to Accountable AI. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a good review and check out my Substack for more insights on AI accountability. Thank you for listening.
If you want to go deeper on AI governance, trust, and responsibility with me and other distinguished faculty of the world's top business school, sign up for the next cohort of Wharton's Strategies for Accountable AI online executive education program, featuring live interaction with faculty, expert interviews, and custom-designed asynchronous content. Join fellow business leaders to learn valuable skills you can put to work in your organization. Visit execed.wharton.upenn.edu/ACAI for full details. I hope to see you there.